ground rules for the briefing this morning. This briefing is on the record and is being recorded. We expect that it will be able to post it on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. Participant audio should be muted and cameras should be off. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the speaker's discussion this morning. We ask that you please use the chat function for questions. Depending on the number of questions and time remaining that we have today, follow-up questions may not be accommodated, but we encourage you to reach out to us directly, and we will get answers to you as quickly as we can. We'll start this morning with Senator Alex Padilla. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you all. Good to see many of my Secretary of State friends on this Zoom, and it's clearly a very, very timely and important conversation. I want to thank Secretary Simon, former colleague of Secretary of State, but now leading up the association, and all the other secretaries for coming together and pulling this briefing together. Look, as a former Secretary of State in California, I know full well the enormity of the job that chief elections officers in every state have. And it's not just on election day. And it's not just in the lead up to election day or the days after an election. It is truly, truly year round. We've come together today across the country and across time zones to make sure that we're highlighting the dangers of the SAVE Act, which has been passed by the House. It's before the Senate as we speak. And if it were to see the light of day in terms of a president's signature, it would have tremendous adversarial ramifications for our democracy. It is not a voter ID bill. Let's get that straight off the top. It is a voter suppression bill, plain and simple. You'll hear about the specific elements of the bill and what those consequences would be during the course of this briefing. But let me also remind us all sort of where exactly things stand. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, it passed the House of Representatives. It's not just before this, it's been brought up by the Senate majority. Senator Thune has gotten us on this bill, and we're now entering day 3 of discussion and debate on this bill with no end in sight. I think in terms of procedure, it's still unclear how they're going to try to get this across the finish line. If it's through regular order, I don't think the votes are there. And so we're on guard for any parliamentary shenanigans to try to sneak this through on a majority vote. Some of them have even threatened to blow up the filibuster over this. That's how desperate they are to get the SAVE Act passed. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats are clearly defending the right to vote. We're on the floor, on watch, and will continue to be day in, day out, overnight as necessary, for days into the weekend, for weeks if necessary, to ensure that this measure doesn't pass because of the dangers of it. In terms of some of the contents, again, we know this is not a voter ID bill. It's a voter suppression bill. We know that Republicans are choosing to focus on this because their record has been so horrible, right? The Trump and Republican Congress economic plan has not just been unpopular, it is wreaking havoc and causing pain for working families across the country. And instead of focusing on that, the price of gas, the price of healthcare, the price of housing, they're choosing to have us focus on this. And the political motivation couldn't be any more clear. The president himself has said, and I'll quote, "Republicans will never lose again if they pass this bill." And so that's why he's forced Senate Republicans' hand to bring this bill up. And it was bad enough when it came over from the House. Folks, it just got worse. There's substitute amendments that have been offered that add even more pain in this bill. The elimination of vote-by-mail opportunities for most people, the elimination of no excuse absentee voting for most people, and of course, some unrelated to elections elements as well. So what's the bottom line for just everyday people wondering what the heck is going on, what's being debated? When they say voter ID, the way they've defined it, a common ID, a driver's license, for example, is not sufficient to get you into the polling place. Your access to the ballot has been denied. And it's not just voting, it's how we register to vote. For those who have benefited from online voter registration, and yes, we know how it works, that opportunity is going to be gone. Mailing in a voter registration card that you sign under penalty of perjury, that will no longer be an option. Voter registration drives that people are familiar with in communities and on college campuses, those will be eliminated. only one way to register: in person, which will require most people to either take time off of work, stand in line, go through all the bureaucratic hoops. It's just unnecessary. Our elections are safe, they are secure. We should be working harder to facilitate voter participation, not putting up unnecessary obstacles or barriers. One of the final things I want to end on: breaking news overnight. Utah, which does not have a Secretary of State in charge of elections, that falls to the lieutenant governor. Utah's lieutenant governor overnight came out in opposition to this bill. Utah's lieutenant governor, a Republican, uh, has come out against the bill in a series of posts last night that we will share because I think it's great content and great insight for the debate that's on the floor right now, being led on the Republican side by Utah Senator Mike Lee. But on the Democratic side, I know my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, is on this Zoom. We remain united, we remain engaged, we remain on watch to make sure that this bill, again, doesn't see the light of day. And if they try in any other form, another bill, another executive order, another anything, we're going to continue to find it and defend our sacred right to vote. And so with that, let me turn it over to the former ranking member of the Rules Committee, former chair of the Rules Committee, my colleague from Minnesota, Senator Amy Klobuchar.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. And thank you for your leadership on this. And I was thinking when you mentioned Utah, Alex and I and Chris Murphy were on the floor last night till like 11 at night because Mike Lee was speaking and he went really long. And I can't think of a kind of a nice cap to that than having his own lieutenant governor's own state oppose that bill. And as many of you may know, Utah is, of course, more of a red state, but it is known for the large number of people that use mail-in balloting. And this bill makes that very difficult. So I'm on here for a few reasons. One, just to commend Alex for the job he's doing. Two, because Steve Simon, my Secretary of State, is such a leader on these issues. And three, I just think this bill, coming from the state that always has one of the highest voter turnouts, is designed to make it harder for people to vote, just the opposite of what we've been doing for so long. It makes it harder for American citizens to vote. Steve has served as our chief elections administrator since 2015, and election after election, with all the provisions we have on hand, early voting, same-day registration, and thanks to work that Steve did actually when he was a legislator as well, online registration, no excuse vote by mail. And we've always been ahead of the curve. And by the way, with those systems going way back, we have had elected statewide Democrats, Republicans, and independents. We gave the world Jesse Ventura as governor. Tim Pawlenty was our governor. During all these times, we had easier ballot access and more straightforward ballot access than a lot of other states have done. And I think it makes people feel like they're part of the franchise when they can actually register to vote. So this bill intentionally undermines these efforts. It's designed, in fact, to kick eligible voters off the rolls. And one of the things that is most concerning is that it requires the states, and I have no idea why the lieutenant governor of Utah, my guess is it's because it makes it so bad for mail-in balloting, but it requires states to hand over all their voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security, which just gave us ICE, to the Department of Homeland Security, which has a tool that it's going to, an algorithm that it's going to take this private state data on voters and then kick out some information, which has not worked well for the states that have signed up for this. There have been people that are eligible voters that they've been told were not eligible. And then you look at the fact that a number of other states have refused to give their voter data when it comes to the Department of Justice already, including four red states or four states with Republican Secretary of the States, which includes the state of West Virginia, Georgia, Kentucky, New Hampshire. So the bureaucratic hurdles, the costliness of this, that you have to then re-register to vote and either get a passport, as Alex pointed out, it's not good enough to have a driver's license, get a passport or get a birth certificate, which in Minnesota I think costs $24, something like that, or get some kind of affidavit created by some process that may or not happen. And in President Trump's own admission, he said, quote, it will guarantee the midterms, end quote. That's what's going on here. And as I noted, our state, no matter which party has won, and we have even numbers at the legislature right now, we believe that we should make it easier to vote. And this bill doesn't do that. And with that, I'll turn it over to our true champion of democracy, Secretary of State Steve Simon. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Senator. Really appreciate it. First, Senator Padilla, I want to thank him as well. He and I were colleagues when he was Secretary of State. He was a leader among us then, and he continues to be a leader nationally on these democracy issues. And Senator Klobuchar, our senior senator from Minnesota, of course, has been a champion not only for voters in Minnesota, but for voters nationwide, and not just from her perch as the former chair of the Rules Committee, but consistently throughout the years. So thank you, both of you. As Secretaries of State, and you're going to hear from more of us in a minute, we are in the democracy business, and we're here in part because this bill is just bad for business. As my Secretary of State colleague will amplify, the bottom line is that the SAVE Act really threatens to interfere with the freedom to vote for millions of eligible Americans. First, it's based on a faulty premise. The false idea that millions of non-citizens are somehow illegally casting ballots. We know that's not true. We know that the incidence of non-citizens voting across America is microscopic. But this myth of massive fraud has been weaponized by those who seem upset because an election didn't go the way they wanted it to go, and who seem to be hunting for some alternative explanation for the election outcome that they dislike. Second, the SAVE Act could shut out millions of eligible voters. You heard Senator Padilla and Senator Klobuchar talk about that. We're talking about U.S. citizens who have often voted for years or even decades who will not be able to vote. And don't just take our word for it. This isn't some theoretical or imagined circumstance. The state of Kansas a few years ago, as many of you know, experimented with this exact approach. They had a mini SAVE Act in the state of Kansas. And before a federal judge invalidated that law, they held an election in Kansas under that law. And in Kansas, during the election that they held under this very regime, over 26,000 eligible Kansans, like in most cases, born and raised American citizens, were shut out and unable to vote because they couldn't produce the proper papers. So that's real. I mean, that happened. That's not just imagined or hypothetical. Third, the SAVE Act would create chaos in the administration of elections. All of us know this. This bill, if passed, would be effective immediately upon passage. Now, just think about that. You go back 3 decades, 4 decades or more, you look at every major elections bill to come out of the U.S. Congress over the last 3 or 4 decades, there has always been a reasonable runway, sometimes many, many years for implementation. Now, as we sit here, we are 229 days away from the general election. Yes, we all have our own countdown clocks around here. 229 days away. That is not a lot of time. And the SAVE Act would require not just our offices, but counties, cities, towns all over America to somehow overnight become experts in determining whether a birth certificate is accurate and real, whether a marriage record is accurate and real, and so forth. And that's just the beginning of the costs. I think some of my colleagues will talk about that. It would impose criminal penalties on election workers, either temporary or permanent, who make a mistake. Criminal penalties. First time I've ever seen that. And so that is dangerous overkill that the American people ought to be aware of. So for those and other reasons, Congress should step back, take a beat, and reject the SAVE Act. My colleagues can say more about their own assessment of the SAVE Act, including how it would impact their particular states. And it's my privilege now to hand it to my colleague, the Secretary of State from the state of Washington, Steve Hobbs.
Thank you, Secretary Simon. And I want to thank the 2 senators for allowing me to speak directly to the American people, along with my fellow Secretaries of State, to tell you the SAVE Act doesn't save anything. It just suppresses Americans' ability to access the ballot box. In fact, in my state, we started to assess the actual costs and burden to Washingtonians. The SAVE Act would require expensive operational, technological, and administrative changes to Washington State's election system at state and county levels. In addition to the millions of additional dollars to operate the elections, it would add burden of showing papers, ID, for every time you vote. That's right. So if you're a vote by mail state, you have to add a copy of your identification. Now, think about that for a moment. Does your 80-year-old mom have a copy machine at home? Because mine doesn't, including my son. He's a young kid, but he doesn't have a printer in his home. So think about the burden of the individual who actually has to conduct these elections. And if your name has changed since you were born, like maybe a marriage, you'll have to go through additional links to prove your eligibility, even though your identification has been verified when you registered and your signature is verified before your ballot is counted. Like in my state, our early estimates show that the overall estimate election cost for the 2026 midterms would increase to $35 to $40 million statewide. That's in November. That's 7 months from now. We are not budgeted for that. The baseline cost of running elections will raise to $4 million. Would most would go to paying for new staff to assess voters who need to show citizenship for new registrations. Washington's 39 counties would face millions of dollars in new costs every year dealing with unprecedented paperwork requirements of the Save America Act. The highest cost would come during federal elections. Updates to the state voter database and registration systems that comply to the act would cost $20 million and would take months to develop. And that's just my state. I'm sure Steve Simon, he's got to update his database, and so does Secretary Thomas. Unless voters need to appear in person to present proof of citizenship documents, there would likely be massive numbers of voters ineligible to vote in federal elections. A last-minute statewide public education campaign to prevent disenfranchisement would cost $3.6 million. Now, previously, when new election requirements are passed by the federal government, we usually get funding. Last time Congress appropriated $3 billion to implement HAVA, $60 million to the state of Washington. With this bill, not a dime, nothing. So these are the costs that states have to burden and individuals have to burden if the SAVE Act is actually passed. Again, the SAVE Act doesn't save anything. All it does is cost Americans the ability to access the ballot box. And with that, I'm going to pass along to my good friend, the Secretary of Connecticut, Secretary Stephanie Thomas.
Thank you, Secretary Hobbs, and thank you, senators, for amplifying this bill for the American public. We have heard a lot of claims that this is just about showing your ID, like you do to board a plane or open a bank account. That's not just an oversimplification, it's a misrepresentation. This isn't about pulling out a driver's license. It's about producing, as you heard, specific citizenship documents like a passport or a certified birth certificate and presenting them in person at your local election office. And for millions of eligible American citizens, these documents can be hard to find at best, expensive, or even impossible to get at worst. So in practice, what does this mean? Imagine a woman, divorced, she's moved, changed her name, and needs to update her voter registration. Under this bill, that is no longer a simple matter. It means tracking down multiple documents and making time to appear in person during regular business hours just to stay eligible to vote. Or imagine 82-year-old man. He just moved into assisted living. He's voted his entire life. He's never had a passport. No one knows where his birth certificate is at this point, and he doesn't have a family member to help him use a computer. That lifelong voter could be blocked, not because he's ineligible, but because he can't produce the right document at the right time. This bill assumes that every voter can navigate these requirements and navigate them quickly, and that is just not reality. When voting requires multiple trips, conducting business solely during business hours, the system isn't just inconvenient, it's exclusionary. And it doesn't stop at registration. In an absurd twist, the in-person ID rules could also apply to absentee voting, raising a very simple question. If you have to appear in person to vote absentee, is it still absentee voting? And just when I thought this bill couldn't get any worse, as you heard, a proposed amendment was just added, requiring voters to provide a specific reason to vote absentee, along with a sworn statement and documentation. So, America, think about what this means. Someone who is sick, hospitalized, has a disability, they have to explain their condition and provide documentation to prove it to their local election official. And caregivers would have to include details about the person they're caring for. America, doctors can't even release your healthcare information to your spouse without permission, but now caregivers are providing it to an election official to judge if it's valid. That is absurd. This bill is not protecting access. It's not building confidence. It's creating barriers for American citizens and all the very same people that voting laws are supposed to protect. And we can't leave out, it's putting more strain on the very people we rely on to run our elections. It's punishing voters, even those who have done every single thing right. This is not about Democrats or Republicans, red states, blue states. It's about whether eligible American voters can access the ballot or whether politicians put new barriers in their way. Our elections are already secure. If you ask my election colleagues in Connecticut what the real threats to our elections are, they will say false claims, a retiring workforce, and underfunding. Let's focus on that instead of putting new barriers between voters and the ballot box, really.
We will now open to questions. You can send them in on the bar. So I have one for Secretary Simon. Does your office have a plan if this bill is passed, and what does it look like?
Well, our plan is to, of course, abide by the law. We always do and always will. But I have to tell you, there's considerable anxiety from election officials across the state, regardless of where they are, regardless of zip code, life background, years of experience. We would have to stand up the infrastructure and help counties and locals do that in order to do the things that you've heard we would be required to do. Assess and somehow analyze things like birth certificates, take in information about someone's medical equipment, come up with standards to determine whether a marriage record is real or not real. These things typically take a lot of time, which is why Congress over the last few decades has very sensibly provided reasonable runways, whether it was the Help America Vote Act or the National Voter Registration Act. It is unheard of for something this sweeping in scope to take effect immediately. And as I mentioned, we're at the 229 day, and that's just to the general election. I'm not even counting our August primary. So would we comply with the law? Of course we would. We'd have to, and we always will. But it would be a particularly hard burden on those on the front lines at the local level. Remember, we don't count votes in our office, right? That all happens at the local level. And those thousands of entrance points across Minnesota would experience tremendous strain and stress.
And if I might chime in, if you don't mind, the reason elections are left up to the states is because every state is indeed quite different. Here in Connecticut, elections are not run at the county level. They are run in each individual municipality. And in some of those towns, election workers may work only 1 hour a week or a few hours a month. So shifting such a burden, voters wouldn't even be able to go during business hours because our voters, our registrars of voters are not working those hours. So the burden to train them, staff those offices, and fund it in such a short timeline is very dangerous.
Thank you. The next question. If the SAVE Act fails to pass in the Senate, do you see the administration using its failure as a pretext to interfere in the midterms by seizing ballots or other election materials, just as we saw in Fulton County? And for the Secretaries of State, what are you doing to prepare to respond to that kind of federal government interference?
Well, I'll chime in here, Steve, if you don't mind, just off the top. Uh, Look, we're in the mode of hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. I don't put anything past Donald Trump and this administration. So not if, but when this attempt at the SAVE Act fails, like for all I know, they're going to try again, maybe tweak the legislation and try another legislative push. Most of what's in this version of the SAVE Act, they've attempted already via executive order last year, which has been blocked by the courts, right? Because the president doesn't have the authority that he claims to have. Doesn't mean he's not going to try again. So we're on the lookout for another executive order attempt. There's been chatter both in the White House and those around the president trying to set the stage for some sort of declaration of emergency and use a national emergency to justify a federal takeover of elections. And that word takeover, by the way, his words. He's been saying that. We're not making this up. So we're having to prepare for all kinds of potential scenarios because we don't put anything past them. Everybody's familiar with the FBI raid, along with the head of intelligence in Fulton County, Georgia. Maybe not as many people have heard about their actions in Arizona, where they're going after the Cyber Ninja audit that showed, by the way, ironically, after the Arizona audit, that Joe Biden won Arizona by a larger margin than the original count. So it's this obsession with the 2020 election that Donald Trump refuses to accept the fact that he lost. That's driving all this. It's all being driven by the big lie. But those of us who take our job seriously, both in the Senate and the professional elections officials at the state and local level across the country, have to just be laser focused on defending our electoral process from these attacks.
And I just add to that, when those judicial cases that Alex brought up, questioning the results of the last presidential election, and he lost every single one of them. His own attorney general said that there was no widespread fraud. Trump judges repeatedly ruled against him, every single one of them. And so there is this track record that you can see in big, bold neon lights where he keeps trying to mess around with the elections. And I just say, instead of calling this a Save America Act, maybe we should be working on the Save Americans Money Act and some of these other things that we should be spending our time on that he doesn't want to deal with housing expenses, electricity going up $110 in just the last year, gas prices skyrocketing, and he instead is pushing through this bill, which is, we know, a number of our Republican colleagues quietly have concerns about. And that's what he wants to do instead. And instead of changing his policies or changing their candidates, they're trying to change who can vote and kick off eligible American citizens from voting.
I would just say this as to what might come in the next few months, next 229 days. We're shadow boxing here to some extent, right? We don't know when it's going to come or in what form. We do know that the president recently said in an interview he wants to, quote, nationalize and, quote, take over elections in as many as 15 places. Look, in our office, we have sort of an all hazards approach when it comes to election. We have to plan for things that may or may not materialize, a bomb threat, a weather event, a power outage, etc. We have to help the locals plan for that. And I regret to say, and it's very sad to say, that in the year 2026, I have to add to that bucket the possibility that our own federal government will do something that will either directly or even indirectly interfere with the freedom to vote. That's never happened before, at least since I've been around. But we do have to plan for it. And that means working with national partners. That means working between and among secretaries of state. That means working, of course, extensively within our states. I know in Minnesota, we are actively gaming out what these scenarios could be. It's a sad thing. In the 2026, we have to treat this like a bomb threat. It's not a prediction, but it is a precaution that we all have to take. It would be irresponsible for us not to be gaming out and thinking through scenarios that involve some form of federal interference. And we're doing that.
A couple of more questions here. If this measure was passed, would court challenges be likely?
Yes.
Well, I'll go.
Yes.
I'll go
Go ahead,
ahead,
Amy.
Senator. I guess I will just say immediately, and I know this from talking to other fellow secretaries, and they're here. We would immediately try to challenge this. We would have to. We have no choice because this takes effect immediately, and a lot of the states, including mine, our legislative session is over. Budgets have been passed, and this has not been funded. And unless the feds plan to add money to this bill, which apparently that has not happened, we're kind of stuck. And by the way, this is unfair anyway, and so we're going to definitely fight legally to the last breath, if need be, to try to stop this from happening.
Thank you. Have you been in touch with the White House about your concerns about the bill, given that a lot of push is coming from the president?
Is that aimed at the secretaries or the senators?
We'll send that to the
I
Senate.
think the senators have been loud and clear. So the White House knows very well where we stand. Our focus has been on our Republican colleagues in the Senate, because again, it's not a hypothetical. It's not a bill that's been introduced and might it come up or might it not come up. Like, it is on the floor of the Senate right now. And so we're, as I mentioned earlier, laser focused, locked in, fighting tooth and nail to make sure it doesn't get over the hump, doesn't get out of the Senate or to the president's desk.
I'll also add, just as a citizen, as every American has the right, I often send my feedback on these bills through the White House portal. And I think everyone should do that if they have an opinion about what's being discussed in Congress. But here in Connecticut, we have a Republican and a Democrat in charge in every single town across the state of our elections. And I speak with them every single month. Many of them stop me, Republicans and Democrats. They are rightly concerned about being sent to jail or fined if they make an innocent mistake in this legislation. They are afraid of all the divisive comments out there. They feel threatened and frightened. And these are the concerns they bring to me. And the leaders of our small towns in particular are concerned about what these unfunded mandates would mean for them. So yes, election officials on both sides of the aisle are very concerned. As I said, this is not a Democrat versus Republican thing. This is an American citizen versus politicians who can't accept the results of elections.
Thank you all very much. We're running up on time, so we'll ask one more question here and the rest that we can get to by email. And I know, Senator Padilla, you have other business you need to get to, so you can jump off now if you need to. The last question is...
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And Senator Klobuchar, thank you as well.
We're going to the same thing, Alex and me. Thanks.
We'll answer this one last question here. The administration has engaged in data collection on voters through the SAVE system and DOJ's effort to collect voter rolls. Your Secretary Simon, your state has resisted these efforts by the DOJ. What's your concern about the uses of this data by the administration?
Well, our position on this starts and ends with the law, not our preferences, not who we like or dislike. Our examination of the law, in particular federal law, leads us to the conclusion that the Department of Justice under these circumstances are not entitled to simply vacuum up this private personal data on millions and millions of voters in Minnesota and elsewhere. And I'll just point out that we are not some sort of island of defiance here. We are among 32 states. I think my colleagues are 2 of the 32 as well. So 32 states, a pretty hefty majority of states who are taking the very same legal position. This is all teed up in court right now. That's exactly where it should be. Why else do we have courts, right? We have a legal position. They have a legal position. Instead of duking it out in the streets, we go to a court of law. And of course, we'll abide by what the judiciary says, but we believe our position is the correct position. So far, 4 states have successfully dismissed the Justice Department's attempts to get this information. We hope to be the 5th. It's in the hands of a judge right now, but that's why we're doing this. It's grounded in starts and ends with our reading of the law, which is the mainstream reading among the states.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to end this and we will have a recording available at a later date.